So we kept talking about upwelling as one of the important processes for driving photosynthesis and biological productivity in the ocean. So here we are. You remember our physics from before. There are upwelling regions on the eastern part of the ocean or the western coasts of continents. So west coast of US, west coast of South America, Africa, Australia, and so on. Even though Australia, you remember, has a special situation because it has water coming from the Pacific through the Indonesian seas, setting up a gradient and a lee-wind current which goes against the winds, but there is some upwelling nonetheless. So you can see that there are processes that are a little bit different. We won't go into the details, but nonetheless has to do with how the ocean produces these eddies or features that are like little tornadoes in the ocean that can pull up nutrients. Okay, nonetheless, these eastern boundary currents, California current, Peru current, Canary current, Benguela current, and the West Australian current have upwelling. Why? Because you add your current direction and Coriolis, you're pulling water away from the coast, so you have to bring up cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface, and so on. So in the southern hemisphere, Coriolis pushes to the left and water away from the coast, and nutrients come up. So cooler, deeper, nutrient-rich seawater. Always remember, nutrients increase with depth. Remineralization and increasing nutrients with depth. So coastal upwelling, western continental margins are a big part of it. This is the same thing blown up, and you can go back to that ocean color image, and the one that's shown here, for example, you can see the high red colors. Primary production is measured as milligrams carbon per meter cubed, okay? Because it's the amount of carbon that's fixed that we are worried about. Milligrams of carbon per meter squared. The numbers can be typically 2 to 5 milligrams per meter cubed, but you can see the red colors here go all the way up to 30 or so. So you can have some highly productive regions. So you can keep visiting the NASA website and keep looking at the ocean color. It's called ocean color images, and you will see some pretty amazing features. But right now we will move on to types of photosynthetic marine organisms. What are the different things that live in the water? We already saw some things like mangroves, we mentioned kelps and so on. So there are Anthophyta, which are the seed-bearing plants. So they have roots, they live in the water, they photosynthesize, and they produce flowers and seeds. And there are macroscopic algae, which means you can just see them by eye. And there are microscopic algae, which can only be seen under a microscope unless there is a huge concentration or a huge colony of those algae. And there are also bacteria that are photosynthetic. Okay, they are actually bacteria which can photosynthesize. That's pretty amazing, right? So here are some examples of the Anthophyta. They have to occur only in the shallow coastal waters because they have roots they set in the water, and then they have to pop out of the water for capturing sunlight and to photosynthesize like mangroves. Okay, so they are primarily so-called seagrasses and of course the mangroves. Just like before, they produce oxygen, they filter nutrients, they act as wave dampers when the storms come in. They provide very rich habitat for shellfish, for small fish, big fish, all the way to many megafauna that live and hunt in the waters. Even some sharks come into mangrove forests. There are Bengal tigers that go into the mangrove forests, and so on. So it is a incredibly valuable interface from land to the ocean, and they serve this important purpose. Macroscopic algae, the so-called seaweeds, which is a very broad terminology. Weed on land is typically something that you don't want. right? So when initially people discovered these things in the water, they call them weeds, seaweeds. Obviously, many seaweeds are very valuable. They are eaten, sushi. They are used for flavoring. They are used for making gelatins that go into toothpaste, into makeup, and all sorts of things. And many of them are known by their colors. So here is a size for reference. There is a cap of a camera put next to this big macroscopic algae. So brown algae typically occur in colder mid-latitude waters. It basically has to do with the color of the pigmentation that's used for photosynthesis. Green algae are more common in fresh water, and they obviously have high chlorophyll. Red algae are abundant and widespread in the ocean. They are the most abundant of the marine macroscopic algae. Even though they are broadly referred to as red algae, they have varying colors, different colors. Like you can see here, it's not necessarily red. Nonetheless, microscopic algae, we already talked about phytoplankton, like diatoms. Diatom is basically something that's symmetric. You can split it open and there's a cell inside. And the tests or testa are silica shells made, and you can see it has like a porous media, so nutrients, waste, and water can get exchanged. Obviously, they have to have enough light going through as well for photosynthesis if they're photosynthetic. And coccolithophores that we talked about. This is silica shell, this is calcium carbonate shell. Remember again, we said that these can die and make it all the way to the bottom and get buried and serve as paleoproxies. So past temperature and upwelling conditions and circulations can be inferred by looking at the chemical signatures and the abundances of these shells that get preserved in the water. Microscopic algae also include dinoflagellates. Dinoflagellates can be autotrophic or heterotrophic, and they can also be mixotrophic. So they don't have a hard shell. Flagella is something you probably already know from English language. They have these little flagella which allows them to move a little. So even though we call them plankton and they mostly drift, they do have little appendages that allow them to change direction. There are also things like trichodesmium, which have gas chambers. They can change their buoyancy and migrate up and down. So not all plankters are purely drifters. They have evolved some organs to change their direction. They don't swim very far. They do drift mostly, but they can change direction, maybe to avoid predation or move towards food and so on. Okay? Dinoflagellates are what form what are called red tides. They are harmful algal blooms, which means they produce usually some kind of toxins that can kill fish, for example, or they can also cause human illness. You have things like ciguatera, parasitic shellfish poisoning, amnesic shellfish poisoning, and so on, that we will see a little bit more of. So harmful algal blooms occur naturally when the upwelling is very strong, nutrient supply is very strong, so-called eutrophic conditions get formed near the surface, and then these are better competitors when there is a rush of nutrients. So they bloom and they look like a huge bloom of red color, nothing to do with the tides, it's just the name, red tide. Okay, so these are something we'll come back to about the toxins. There are many forms of toxins. Probably you experience, unfortunately, some form of fish poisoning maybe, so you have to be always careful. And then the question is, how are harmful algal blooms changing because of global warming? Right? This is always something we have to keep going back to global warming. It turns out that warm temperatures, low nutrient conditions, etc., actually favor some harmful algal blooms and some jellyfish. So we have to be always careful about that as well.